Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining me at the Bipartisan Policy Center for our event today, talking about divided government. One of the things I love about working here is the opportunity to continue to engage with really historic figures who made an incredible impression on this country and really helped advance public policy. And so I'm truly honored today to be able to interview former Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, who has been a friend and family of BPC since our founding, really. So Mississippi's Trent Lott, he came to Capitol Hill in 1968 to work as an administrative assistant for Representative William Colmer. When Colmer retired in 1972, Lott succeeded him, served 8 terms in the House, including 8 years as a Republican whip. He was elected to the Senate in 1988, became the Senate Republican whip in 1993, becoming the only person to hold the position in both the houses of Congress. Known for his organizational skills and member-to-member negotiations, he is credited with modernizing the whip office and creating the model that's still in operation today. Senate Republicans chose him as floor leader in 1996, and he served 5 years as majority leader. Throughout his career, he actively forged bipartisan coalitions with Democrats on the Hill and in the White House, and he guided the Senate through some of its toughest times, including the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton, and of course, the response to the terrorist attacks in 2001. And as I said, he has been a part of our friend and our family here at BPC for years. Senator, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with me today.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's good to be with you today and to participate again with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I just think it's such a great organization that is needed in Washington. I've always appreciated the fact that Bob Dole, Tom Daschle, George Mitchell, and Howard Baker came up with this idea and got it started. And there was a need for it back in those days, which I guess was in maybe even the 90s or turn of the century, but we need it even more today. Bipartisanship is not a dirty word. It is the art of government. So I thank you for what you do there at the BPC, and I'm glad to still participate with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I know you and I first got to meet when we did our Commission on Political Reform back in 2013. And I remember at the time we were working with Senator Snowe and Senator Daschle, and we thought, well, it can't get worse than this. And now 10 years later, it did.
Well, one of the things that I did to try to get things done, I used to have problems with the Senator from Maine, Olympia Snowe, on some of the Republican issues. And so when I was the whip in the House the last 2 years, I made Olympia Snowe my chief deputy whip. And some of my conservative Republican friends said, why did you do that? She doesn't vote with us half the time. I said, that's why I did it. I think maybe if she's on the plane when we take off, she'll be on it with us when we land. And it made a lot of difference, because sometimes she'd make us sober up, in effect. We'd have a leadership meeting, we get all excited about what we're going to do. And then sometime I'd say, well, Olympia, what's the contrarian view? When she would get through telling us what we had considered from a woman's standpoint or a Northeast standpoint, we'd say, oh, maybe we better rethink that education issue. So there's a need for a variety of points of view, and certainly a need for bipartisanship for the good of our country.
Well, so I want to dive into some of what's going on right now. Yes, you and our listeners all know we just came through this awful debt ceiling battle. And I think many of us assumed once they had the agreement, we were kind of free and clear a little bit, but it does look like more and more that we may be facing a government shutdown. You have been through these battles in the past. First, on the debt ceiling agreement itself, any reaction to that?
Well, I have quite a history on debt ceiling, like a lot of other things. When you've been here as long as I have in Washington and been in Congress as long as I was, you've had a lot of experiences with some of the issues they're dealing with now. On the debt ceiling, when I first came to Congress as a new member in 1973, almost every year I voted against debt ceiling increases until I was whipped when Reagan was president. And in 1985 or so, one day I got a call from the president, and he said, say, Whip, aren't you the guy that counts votes and gets votes? We've got to get the votes for this debt ceiling, or we're going to have a disaster on our hands, a government shutdown. And I said, yes, sir, Mr. President. And I went to work. We got the votes. And from that point on, including all of my 19 years in the Senate, I always voted for the debt ceiling. I don't like it. My proudest moment as a member of Congress was when I helped make the deal with President Bill Clinton that led to 4 years of a balanced budget and 2 years of an actual surplus. But the debt ceiling is not about what you're going to do in the future. It's about what you've already done. It's like a credit card. You've already spent it, and you have to acknowledge it, deal with it, but then try to do something where it's not as bad. The next time you have to confront a debt ceiling. So that's what I hope they'll do this time. They got the debt ceiling done. I thought that Speaker McCarthy did a good job. I thought that the president's team was responsive. So they got an agreement. Now, some people in the Congress don't like it, and they're going to start raising some issues on a variety of bills. But I think I'm an incurable optimist. I think they can get it done. Now, one of the things they've got to do is the appropriations bills for the year. And appropriations are what keeps the government running. It's for education, transportation, housing, you name it. So they've got to get it done. Well, some people say, well, you've got this group in the House that's saying that they're not going to vote for these appropriations bills, even if it meant, it makes what was agreed to in the budget negotiations, the debt ceiling. But I've got a response to that. If you're just counting on one party or the other to get the thing done in appropriations bill, it may not work. Here's the answer: bipartisanship. Get an overwhelming number of responsible Republicans, and see if there's not some cooperative Democrats that might think, oh, maybe we do need to get health and education done for the good of the country. We may not like the number. Maybe it won't be high enough for some. It'll be too high for others. But the best deal is not the last deal. The best deal is the next deal. And you've got to continue to try to work to get a result for the American people.
So the debt ceiling conversation, the continuing resolutions and the appropriations process, that is really all sort of inside baseball. I don't know that it's followed terribly back. Do you hear about those things back home?
Not really. The things you hear about back home are the things that people directly deal with. For instance, I'm going to be speaking to the Farm Bureau in statewide meeting in Mississippi next week. Now, they're going to want to know about the agriculture bill. And they, in the past, we've been able to get agriculture bills done pretty easily. Not so much anymore, because agriculture is not just about soybeans and corn. It's also about food stamps and nutrition programs. And so you got difficulties there. So I hear about agriculture. I hear about the defense of our country, even for people that are not directly related to defense, even though my hometown is where we build very large amphibious ships and destroyers. So I have to pay attention to defense, but it's all about the security of our country. People want to know, what is the situation in Ukraine? Are we doing the right thing? How are we, being prepared to deal with threats from other parts of the world? But the main thing people want to know is, hey, when you going to get inflation under control so my grocery bills can quit going up? And by the way, I paid $5.39 a gallon for gas last week. Can you do anything about that? So when I go back home, and I still work the trenches because I love what I did and I love what I do. I try to stay in touch with people, and I listen to them when I go home, and the students too. It's very interesting when I talk to the students at the Trent Lott Leadership Institute at the University of Mississippi. The questions they ask, first of all, they're very good, very challenging. But usually what they're asking about is people issues. What is going to be happening with education in America? And are we going to have true free speech even on college campuses? And what is going to be the situation financially when I try to graduate and get a job? So you got to keep it real and down on the ground where the critters can get it.
Well, I ask about that because, in my time on the Hill or in DC, we've had a couple shutdowns, and it does feel like somehow the public generally views those as the fault of the Republicans, regardless of who was in the way. And so I'm just kind of curious from your experience, you've got the Democrats have the bully pulpit of the White House. What do Republicans need to do to address, if we shut down, the messaging around this?
They should not have a shutdown. They've got to find a way to work around it. That's the dumbest thing in the world. It affects innocent people. Like we discussed earlier, I was, the Republican whip, House and Senate, and I was majority leader. But I learned early on to get things done for the country. Quite often, I had to work not only on the Republican side of the aisle, but ease over on the Democratic side and say, "Can you help me with this defense bill, or can you help me on the budget?" You know, when we got the budget agreement and the surplus, it was a deal we made with Tom Daschle, who was a Democratic leader in the Senate, Newt Gingrich, the Speaker in the House, and Bill Clinton, the Democrat. So you got to find a way to get things done, and it quite often, almost always, means you got to work across the aisle to see if you can't get some sort of reasonable agreement. When I look at the House, I see some things I do like. For instance, I think Speaker McCarthy and Democrat leader Jeffries have possibly a working relationship. You need that. You know, when I was in the House, Bob Michael, bless his heart, from Illinois, was the Republican leader, and Tip O'Neill was the Speaker, and Jim Wright was the Majority Leader. But they talked. They had friendships, and Speaker O'Neill, when we got the budget savings in the Reagan administration, the Speaker could have blocked us from even having a vote. He didn't do it. Now, I think he thought he was going to win it. We wound up, thanks to the persuasiveness of Reagan and a good whip organization, we got it done. But he could have stopped it. But he said, no, that's part of the process. I may not like the result, but we've got to allow the members to have their vote.
So I think there, and you know this because you're up there a lot still, is that there's actually a lot more bipartisanship going on than we hear in the media. And to those conversations and those personal relationships, we hear a lot from members of Congress that they have friends on the other side of the aisle, but that stuff just doesn't get reported on very much, which is a little frustrating for those of us like who advocate for bipartisanship and for collaborative government. And I think there's more going on than meets the eye.
Well, let me just give you a current example. Anybody that tried to fly over the last 2 or 3 weeks during the 4th of July recess, it was not fun. Maybe sometime it was the weather, sometime it was staffing for the aircraft, sometime it was air traffic control, a whole lot of things. And so there is a bill pending in Congress for the Federal Aviation Administration. Well, first of all, we need a full-time FAA administrator. The president, I think, has come up with one that will be acceptable. I think he'll get a bipartisan vote and get it done. But now I see the chairman of the Committee with Jurisdiction, Commerce, Science, and Transportation, Maria Cantwell, and the ranking Republican, believe it or not, Ted Cruz, are talking and working together. John Thune, who is the whip on the Republican side, he's working on the aviation bill. They've run into some problems in getting it done. And, a lot of people want to place the blame in different places. And you got issues like pilot training requirements and aircraft routes. But they are working through, and I think they're going to wind up getting it done. And it's not going to be a partisan vote, but it's about safety. It's about travel. And so I think there's an example of where things can be worked out that would be in the best interest of the flying public in America and frankly around the world. I mentioned agriculture. I used to have a hard time trying to protect cotton interests from Mississippi, and I had to wrestle with my friends from Iowa and Kansas over corn and soybeans. It was never easy, but we need agriculture in America. And if we do it in the right way, we can not only feed America, we can feed the rest of the world. We can sell our crops. But I think you'll see that there'll be a bipartisan effort to get an agriculture bill. But there will always be somebody that won't say no. And in the House, it doesn't take many. The House is very closely divided. Only, I think, 5 more Republicans than Democrats. Speaker McCarthy is riding the whirlwind. And so he's going to be forced to have to get some bipartisan votes. The same thing is true in the Senate. I mean, you got a filibuster in the Senate. On most issues, you got to get 60 votes to break a filibuster. The only way Leader Schumer is going to get it done is to get 10 Republicans. But if you look over the last few years, in the case of infrastructure and CHIPS legislation, they've been able to get the bipartisan vote. So there is hope, but it's going to take leadership. And sometimes our leaders don't do enough to make it work.
So let's look a little bit about at the inter-party issues because, or intra, and because so both Schumer and McCarthy have very divided caucuses. You look at McCarthy coming off of the budget vote, you do have this group from the Freedom Caucus who are holding up rules, and then you do have a group that voted for the bill who are getting hammered back home for that vote. How does he go about kind of bridging those divides within his party?
You mean McCarthy?
McCarthy.
Well, he's got a challenge on his hands. I think he's got a good leadership team, though. Steve Scalise, the majority leader from Louisiana, has got a lot of friends on the Democratic side. You remember he got shot when he was practicing baseball, and when he came back to the floor of the Senate, a Democrat congressman from New Orleans came across from the Democratic side and went over and stood next to Steve Scalise on the Republican side. So that's a good sign, and they've got a good whip. I've got my buddy Senator John Breaux, who's been my partner for 15 years, a Democrat from Louisiana. He was just saying a day or two ago that these new demands by the so-called Freedom Caucus, also known by some as the Hell No Caucus, if they got 20 members and say we're not going to vote for anything, then McCarthy, what's he going to do? And the answer is, hey, go across the aisle, see if there's not 20 or 30 Democrats or more that might want to vote with you on, an aviation bill or an agriculture bill or a defense bill, all of which need to pass this year. We have for the last, I don't know, at least 25 years, Congress has managed to pass a National Defense Act every year without fail. And as difficult as agriculture's been, as long as I can remember far back, we managed to get the agriculture bill every year done. It's kind of frozen right now. But because they're so closely divided, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, they're going to be forced to find a way to come together to get some bipartisan votes. It may not be perfect. It rarely is. But as my good friend, Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader when I was Republican leader, likes to say, compromise is the oxygen of democracy.
So given the closeness, though, of the two chambers, and there's always an election looming, are those Democrats, are there going to be Democrats motivated to try and find a solution in the House, or
well, actually,
to let them fail?
And I think this is what's different now from what it was like years ago when I was in the House. You've got this element within the Republican Party, the so-called Freedom Caucus, that really would be satisfied to have a government shutdown. And you've got an element on the Democratic side that would say, hey, let these Republicans stew in their own juice. Why should we help them? The answer is for the good of the country. So, look, I always, philosophically, I was right of center. I always thought I was a conservative. And now, I don't know, I guess I look like a moderate, but I haven't moved. And what has happened, and I don't know quite who to blame for this, but, Democrats have moved further to the left, Republicans moved further to the right. And as the poet Yeats said in one of his famous poems, the center will not hold. Where is the center? When I was the whip in the House, I always had to work with the boll weevil Democrats, so-called conservative, moderate Democrats, mostly from the South. Otherwise, we couldn't win. So I had to watch, my conservative base. Then when I moved to the Senate, I got to be whip and leader. I had to worry about my moderates from New England and the Midwest. But they're in both cases, there was a center group that you had to work with. Earlier it was conservative Democrats. In the Senate, it was more moderate to liberal Republicans. That's not a bad thing. Different points of view are not poison. Different points of view are to be listened to. In fact, I had one leader that always said that I knew that in the Senate said, if you have information, don't share it because others will use it against you. My attitude was, if you had good intelligence and good information, share it, and it probably will multiply.
I like that approach better.
Well, my wife said that I was always too dumb to be able to keep a secret anyway.
Well, but you're right though, like sharing information and having these conversations, the worst you can do is at the end of the day decide you just can't agree.
Sure.
But you may actually find a middle ground. And the problem
Yeah.
is, even in society in general, we don't have those conversations anymore. We're really just
Yeah.
talking to our people who agree with us.
Yeah. Well, again, when I was in the Senate working with Tom Daschle, and there was Tom, he was a sort of prairie liberal Democrat, and I was a Southern conservative Republican. And yet we talked every day. We had a good relationship. Our staffs communicated. We actually had red phones on our desk. He had one, I had one. And when I picked it up, it only rang one place, on Tom Daschle's desk. And people said, well, why'd you have that? And I said, well, first of all, it was quick. Secondly, some time to get around our own staff, because they didn't necessarily like what Tom Daschle and I were cooking up. And sometimes get around the press so we could talk freely until we could reach an agreement. But communication and chemistry are so important in life, and certainly in governing and in leadership. You've got to have that's why I had things like the Seersucker Thursday, the Singing Senators, Tartan Day, where I wore a kilt on the floor of the Senate. And the Senator Kit Bond from Missouri came over and said, those are the ugliest legs I've ever seen on the floor of the Senate. Why did I do that? It was not to look goofy like I was wearing a skirt. It was to, and Democrats got into the game, and we laughed at each other. We had fun together. That was one of my mottos. If you can sing together, if you can have fun together, you probably can work together. So leadership, communication, you can't get things done without that.
So let's look at the Senate a little bit here, because as I mentioned earlier, Schumer has just as many challenges as McCarthy. He's got to bring Joe Manchin and Elizabeth Warren together. He has, one seat majority. But as we talked offline earlier, he's trying to do some things around artificial intelligence and competitiveness. What are some of his challenges and opportunities going forward between now and the next election?
Well, I think he's doing the right thing on artificial intelligence. I don't think most of us even really understand what it is and how it can be used positively in the country, or how it can be used against us by, potential enemies. So before they start legislating or trying to legislate on the protections for the good or the bad on artificial intelligence, they need to get a better understanding of what it really is, how it works, what it means, and how are you going to regulate it. So that I think he's doing the right thing by doing that. But I think also he's got to find a way to work with Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, and the two women that head the Appropriations Committee, Patty Murray and Susan Collins. For the first time in history, the four senior members on the Appropriations Committee, the four leaders, Republican, Democrat, all women. And they've got a tough job to do. Now, I understand that Chairman Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, and Susan Collins plan to move their appropriations bill in regular order and have them ready to go. But that won't do any good if Leader Schumer doesn't schedule them for floor action. And by the way, even if the Senate comes to agreement, which they probably can on most of these appropriation bills, still got to deal with the House, who probably will want to spend less than what the Senate wants to spend. But, like everything else, I used to say, if my number is 10 and your number is 14, how will 12 do?
Yep.
And Tom Daschle and I, when we were in the Senate, I was a right of center, he was a left of center. But we talked and we worked and we communicated. We talked to our other leaders, and we found the sweet spot, usually somewhere between the two of us. It wasn't perfect, but if you go back and look at the things we got done, I think most of them were pretty good for the country.
Well, we got a couple more minutes, and then I will turn to audience questions. And for those watching us online, you can put your questions in the chat or on Twitter at BPC_live. So you mentioned agriculture, the Farm Bill, and AI. What are some of the other areas do you think the two parties should be able to come together?
Well, this year, I was thinking about it, and I've been having a lot of meetings about it, talking to members of Congress. I'm going to be going up this very afternoon to talk to a number of members. I'm going to talk to Senator Thune, the whip in the Senate, and then I'm going to go on the House side and talk to a lot of the leaders over there about what they're doing and what they hope to do. But number one, they got to get the appropriations bills done. I mean, that's the basic stuff that keeps the government operating. You're not talking about the entitlements that are mandatory. You're talking about, as I said, transportation, housing, energy, defense of our country. So they're going to have to do the appropriations bills one way sooner or later, or if they don't, part of the government would shut down, but I think they'll get it done. They've got to do this defense bill. We've got a lot of threats now. Right now, the Chinese Navy is bigger than the United States Navy. Who would have believed that? Now, I think our Navy is probably superior, but numbers matter. We better be thinking about what do we need going forward to keep the peace. And the way you keep the peace is being strong militarily. I mentioned agriculture. We got to have a new agriculture extension. It's so important. And it's not just about feeding corn to our chickens. It's about beef, and it's about exports that we count on to make money. So they got to do an ag bill, and I think they need to do the aviation bill. We got demands there, and it's frankly a little scary from a safety standpoint. We need more air traffic controllers. What's the answer? Put more money in it, hire more, train more air traffic controllers. So I think at the end of the year, if we've done the appropriations bill, a defense bill, the agriculture bill, and an aviation bill, it'd be a damn good year's work.
That would be great, especially the appropriations bills, because I don't even remember the last time they got all 12 of them done.
Well, I can tell you the answer. It was the first year I was the majority leader in 1996. Oh. It's been that long.
That's that you're right. That is the first job, fund the government. So,
but one of my rules on appropriations was that I would tell people, okay, we're going to do the defense bill the week before Memorial Day recess. And we would go home for Memorial Week when we finished the bill, but not before. Usually we'd finish up on Thursday night or Friday morning, and then we'd go home for Memorial Week. But then coming back the 1st of June, my attitude was it was appropriations all day, every day until they were all done. And it ate up most of June and July. But then we could move on to other stuff.
So you mentioned earlier being an optimist. I guess you have to be at this, spend your career in Washington. We're about to go into another very contentious presidential election, and our politics seems to be at a nastiness level that we haven't seen in a while. Although for some reason, and I was telling you this before, maybe it's just because we're 6 months out from one and 18 months away from the next one, it feels like things are a little bit better. I just kind of want to get your sense for the state of the politics and how you're feeling about the debate going into the election.
Not real good.
Okay.
I have to be honest with you. I don't like some of the things that are happening. I don't like calling each other names, and a little bit of that is going on. I am concerned about former President Trump and President Biden's age. They're my age or older. And, you got to know when to hold them and when to fold them. I just, watched President Biden speaking to the NATO meeting in Lithuania, and he was doing a really good job. He showed some energy. He stumbled one time or so, but who doesn't? He was good enough that I went down the hall and talked to my partner, Senator John Breaux, and said, hey, you need to be turning the TV on and watch Biden. He's doing a pretty good job. But I don't know. We got a long way to go, and we've got some good men and women that are willing to put their names and their lives on the line to lead our country. I don't think we see the full story yet, but I personally would like to see us go to a younger generation in both parties.
So speaking of the younger generation, you mentioned it went at the top of the hour. Your institute at Ole Miss. So we've been doing a lot to work with college campuses, including your institute. We have a project looking at free speech on college campuses. Talk to me about what you're doing tell us about the institute and why did you found it?
Well, when it was getting time to begin to look like I was going to retire at some point, I was majority leader, had just been elected majority leader, and the chancellor of the University of Mississippi, Robert Kayat, who was a two-sport All-American in college football, baseball, and kicked for the Redskins, of Lebanese extraction, longtime friend. He came to me and said, "Hey, we'd like to do something in your honor. Maybe we could have a roast dinner and name a chair of political science in your honor." And I said, "No, Chancellor, for three reasons. I've been to these roasts before. I've been roasted. I don't need that again. Thank you very much. Secondly, I don't think I want a chair of political science named in my honor because I'm afraid they'll have a political science professor that would be saying a lot of stuff I didn't agree with. So I want to do something for the students, not just for the faculty and all." So he said, and I said, "By the way, I don't think I deserve anything like that just yet." So he said, "Okay." He went away. He came back a few years later when I was, in that leadership position. He said, "I think I have it. I've thought about it and talked to people. Let's have an institute of public policy and leadership degree granting program where we focus on training young men and women, students at college level to be leaders." And one of the things I say to the students at the Leadership Institute at Ole Miss is that I believe most leaders are born. You just are inclined to be a leader or want to be a leader or not. But I do think that even if you are inclined to be a leader, you can learn to be a better leader by studying leadership techniques and tactics. What did Churchill do that was so special, and bring in leaders to talk to these students, men, women, minorities of all backgrounds. I even urged the Leadership Institute, see if we can find some Native American students that we could bring into the Leadership Institute and help them understand how to become leaders in their tribes or in their communities. And so we kicked it off. We raised money. I have to admit, I got some earmarks of federal money to renovate. Somebody said, "Well, you ought to build a new building for this." I said, "No, let's take a triangle of old buildings and let's modernize them." And that's what we did. And we got some really good leaders there. Billy Gottschall, who's the director of the program, had been my chief of staff. Dr. Melissa Jones, who is the associate there, has her bachelor's, master's, doctorate, and law degree. And she is fantastic. And now we are actually recruiting students from all over the country to study leadership. One of the problems we have is we have more applications than we have slots for students. We actually were bringing in 47 a year. I think we just got it up to 83, but we get like 247 applications for 47 slots. So, other schools ought to look at this. I've found that the students in the program really are good. They learn from it. They like the professors we have. I talk to them every year, 2 or 3 times. Sometimes I get a little concerned, a little depressed about what I see in young people with the social media and everything. And then I speak to these leadership students and I say, "Wait a minute, we're going to be okay. These will be the leaders. They're out there, but we can train them to be better leaders."
Well, I think that's great. And to your point, it would be wonderful to have more of them across the country because these young people who are just entering college now have only really known political dysfunction.
That's true.
You don't know the government is one where the White House and the Congress work together and we solve solutions and people have reasonable conversations. So it would be great to get more students through programs like this one.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm certainly going to keep working on it. And I have 2 grandchildren now working in Washington. So the tradition continues.
That's wonderful. So back to Republican politics a little bit. So we are seeing this movement from the GOP in terms of economic policy. We're sort of the Chamber of Commerce party, certainly when I was on the Hill. And now you've got this populist side that's really gaining traction. Where do you think is where are we going? Where's the Republican Party going on economic policy?
I think it can be good or bad. I did feel like sometime in the past, maybe we were a little bit too tied to big business and corporate America. I was very close to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when I was in Congress and in leadership. Usually I spoke to them at one of their first breakfasts every year about what we were going to be doing. I don't think populist is a dirty word. I think if you look at the definition, basically it's about, working with the people. I do think, for instance, being honest here now, when President Trump was running in 2016, I had a place in central Mississippi where we were living after Katrina destroyed our home on the Gulf Coast. And the workers that came to work with me at my farm, on my generator, or on my tractors, or on my fields, or with my animals, they were all for Trump. And it kind of surprised me. The answer for the Republicans is, don't go just one side or the other. Talk to corporate America. Help them get what they need to create jobs for working Americans. Listen to the carpenter and the laborer, the people that are making the country run. So I think Republicans need to keep a balance. But it clearly has changed, Michelle. We used to be pretty much of the big business corporate sort of guys. I remember saying when I was on the Judiciary Committee way back in the 1970s, big business is not bad business. But you need to also be aware that there are more jobs created by small businesses than by big businesses. So again, it's like everything else. You got to find a balance. And I hope Republicans will be careful about that. I'm really excited as a Republican to see people like Tim Scott and Nikki Haley
You mentioned
running.
Katrina.
They're going to be good. Did I lose you, Michelle?
Hello?
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry, I had a little lag in the computer. Sorry about that.
All right.
But you had mentioned Katrina, and obviously, you had a home devastated by the hurricanes, and it felt like the nationwide response to Katrina was, it was bipartisan, it was very strong. And now, the disaster response has been, it almost becomes a political football or a bargaining chip on the Hill these days. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how that happened and how do we get back to responding to people in crisis in the moment without the politics.
Having dealt with disasters in my own state of Mississippi, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, we've had everything but locusts. But I do think one of the roles of state and local and federal government is to have disaster declarations and come to the aid of the people. When you have been totally destroyed by a hurricane, you need help and you need it quick. You need the Corps of Engineers to be engaged. You need businessmen and women. You need volunteers. And to my amazement, it's gotten a little harder even now to get disaster declaration that you need. And one of my mottos always was to thinking about previous wars, always ride to the sound of the cannons. In other words, whenever there's a big problem, a lot of noise, or a disaster, go there. If you're a president, if you're a governor, you get hit by a disaster, whether it's a fire in the West or flood in California or in Vermont, the leadership of the state and local and federal government need to be there. Now, it can be abused. You can get too much, or sometimes you can designate a disaster that really doesn't merit it. There should be rules about that. But I have found that presidents, Republican and Democrat, have been good about declaring national disasters or natural disasters when you have them. And you couldn't do without it. After Katrina, our governor, Haley Barbour, was magnificent. He and his wife, they were there with us. He came and saw it himself. He promised he would be there when we needed it, and he was. Our president came to bat for us. The Congress did their job. So I would urge the Congress and the president to always, when you have a disaster, that's when you really need government. the most.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so I've got one final question for you, and then I'll let you run up to the hill. So again, when you and I were working together the first time, it was around congressional reform, and you and Senator Daschle put together a proposal on filibuster reform, which included on the motion to proceed. Since then, our team has been working with the House. There was a select committee in the House on the House modernization. They looked at some reforms over there just to help the institution work better. To your point earlier about process, sometimes if you just have the process in place, some of these issues can be worked through that way. Is there any, how do we get some reform movements going in the Senate, or do you even think they're needed?
Yeah, I do. And, I think that the House has tried to work on that some and probably need to do some more. Times change and you need to take a look at your rules and what you can do better. I actually had a select committee headed by former Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico to help us modernize, if you will. But in some ways, you don't need modernizing as much as you need to go back to the way it used to be. It's called regular order. Used to, a subcommittee would do hearings and do serious work, and they'd recommend legislation to the full committee. Then the full committee would debate, have amendments on both sides, and they would report out. And the Senate would act, and the House would act. And oh, by the way, they'd go to a conference between the two bodies, which is almost a rarity now, to work out the details. I remember one time I was having problems on a budget issue with former senator, now governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine. And he was upset about something that wasn't good enough in the Senate bill. And I said, Mike, help us on this. Let's get this through. Let's let the House act. We'll go to conference and we'll fix it. And he said, okay, well, you better. When it turned out, we went to conference and we fixed it. So modernization, I remember when I was in the House, we had a hard time agreeing to allow television coverage of the House of Representatives and to have C-SPAN. Now, everybody can just expect that. But times change, modern technology changes, and the Congress needs to get with the program.
Well, on that note, I think I'm losing internet again, so I'm going to draw us to a close here.
Okay.
Senator, thank you so much. It is always an honor to talk with you. I so appreciate getting your insights into Congress and our current politics, and thank you again for joining us. It's been a
Well,
real
let me
joy.
just add one thing. The Bipartisan Policy Center does a great job. They're going to have great new leadership with Margaret Spelling. We need bipartisanship. This is the entity in Washington that can help make it happen.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for joining us today.